All right, let's jump right in. We're taking a deep dive into the box office this week. It's been a pretty strange fall season for movies, kind of slow actually. But there are some interesting things happening. We've got this Associated Press article that breaks down the numbers and points out some of the upcoming releases we should be excited about.
What's interesting is that Venom, The Last Dance, it's been at the top of the box office for 3 weeks in a row now.
3 weeks straight.
Yeah,
But that's not exactly Avengers kind of numbers, you know?
right. It's not breaking records.
Yeah.
But I think that might actually be a sign of how weak this fall season has been overall.
Yeah, like if there was some huge blockbuster out right now, I don't think Venom would be hanging on to that #1 spot. But here's another thing that's interesting. Venom is actually doing really well internationally. It's made almost 3 times as much money overseas as it has domestically. What do you think that says about how studios are approaching these big budget films these days?
Yeah. Well, it definitely highlights the increasing importance of the international market.
Yeah.
Studios are really trying to make these blockbusters appeal to a global audience,
Right.
which makes you wonder if Hollywood is starting to shift its focus away from domestic audiences.
It's like they're playing a whole different ball game now. Okay, but let's move on to the two movies that are fighting for second place. On one hand, we've got Heretic. That's a Hugh Grant horror movie.
Wow.
Yeah, talk about unexpected, right? And then we've got The Best Christmas Pageant Ever, which is exactly what it sounds like, a feel-good holiday movie. It's pretty wild to see those two genres going head-to-head like that.
Yeah, and that's actually a pretty close race. Technically, Heretic did better in ticket sales from Friday to Sunday.
But The Best Christmas Pageant Ever had some sneak peek screenings earlier in the week. So overall, it's actually slightly ahead. I think what's interesting here is that both of these movies were made on pretty modest budgets. So even if they don't end up at the top of the box office, they're still likely to make a profit.
Exactly. Being number one isn't everything. Smart budgeting and knowing your audience are just as important.
Totally. Now, I do want to talk about the reviews for Heretic for a second. A lot of the critics are really praising Hugh Grant's performance in the movie. They're saying he's actually really good at being terrifying.
Yeah, it seems like he's really stepping outside of his usual rom-com roles, and the critics are loving it. But here's the thing. Audiences actually gave it a pretty lukewarm C+ cinema score.
Wow, really? So we've got this disconnect between the critics and the general audience. What do you make of that?
Well, you have to consider that horror fans might have gone into the movie expecting a certain type of horror movie, and maybe a Hugh Grant horror movie just didn't quite meet those expectations. Whereas critics are probably focusing more on Grant's performance than on whether the movie fits into typical horror conventions.
Yeah, that's a good point. It shows how expectations and marketing can really shape how people perceive a movie. All right, so on the other hand, we've got The Best Christmas Pageant Ever, which has a solid A cinema score from audiences.
Yeah, and that's not surprising given the target audience. Families looking for a heartwarming holiday movie, they're probably going to enjoy something like that.
Right. Plus, it's based on a popular children's book, so there's already that built-in nostalgia factor. But hey, it's not just these new releases that are doing well. Some of the older films are still holding their own.
Absolutely. Like The Wild Robot is in its 7th week,
Yeah.
and it's still doing great. That shows you how much staying power family-friendly animated movies can have.
Yeah, for sure. And then there's Anora, that indie film. It's starting to generate some awards buzz as it expands to more theaters.
Oh, yeah. Anora is a great example of a smaller movie, finding its audience through word of mouth and critical acclaim. And we can't forget about Conclave, the papal thriller. It's actually exceeding expectations for an adult-oriented drama.
Wow. So even though the box office is kind of slow overall, there are still all these different genres finding their niche.
It just goes to show you the importance of catering to specific tastes, even in a market like this. But speaking of the slow box office, we can't ignore the fact that this fall season is lagging behind last year's numbers. The article lays out some pretty stark statistics.
Right. So what do you think is contributing to this downward trend?
Well, I think it's important to remember that we're still navigating a post-pandemic world. Audience behavior has changed. And movie theaters are facing some tough competition from streaming services.
Okay, so things might be a bit bleak right now, but there's light at the end of the tunnel. The article mentions a bunch of big movies coming out soon. Red 1, Gladiator 2, Wicked, and Moana 2.
Yeah, those are some big names,
Yeah.
especially Red One. With its massive budget and stars like Dwayne Johnson and Chris Evans, expectations are really high for that one, and it could be just what the box office needs to get back on track.
And some experts are predicting that the Thanksgiving corridor could actually see some of the biggest box office numbers in recent years. Okay, so let's just recap for a second. What have we learned about this unusual fall season? Venom is showing us the power of the international market, and movies like Heretic and The Best Christmas Pageant Ever are proving that you don't have to be number one to make a profit.
Right, and then you have those family-friendly films like The Wild Robot that just keep chugging along, and the critical darlings like Anora that are starting to make a splash. It's a real mixed bag out there,
Yeah.
but there's something for everyone.
So here's the big question. With streaming services getting more and more popular, will these big releases be enough to get people back into movie theaters? Or are we seeing a fundamental shift in how people watch movies?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's something we're going to explore in more detail after the break.
Yeah, it really is a big question. It feels like it's been on everyone's mind in Hollywood for a while now. You have all these big, spectacular movies coming out, the kind of movies that seem like they were made for the big screen experience.
Yeah, like Gladiator 2. Just imagine all those epic battle scenes and chariot races on a massive screen. And then there's Wicked with those amazing musical numbers and costumes. It's like they're not just movies, they're events, you know?
Right, and that's what draws people to theaters in the first place. It's about having that shared experience that you just can't get at home.
Yeah, there's something special about sitting in a dark theater surrounded by a bunch of other people who are just as into the movie as you are.
Totally. It's an escape, you know?
Hmm.
A chance to forget about everything else and just get lost in the story.
For sure. But then you have the convenience of streaming services. I mean, you can watch whatever you want, whenever you want. And you don't even have to leave your couch. Yeah, no argument there. Streaming has totally changed how we watch movies.
And let's be honest, with ticket prices so high these days, streaming just makes more sense for a lot of people. But here's what I find interesting. That movie Conclave, it's an adult drama, and it's actually doing pretty well at the box office. It's holding its own against all the superhero movies and family films.
It is interesting. It makes you wonder if certain types of movies actually benefit from being seen in a theater.
Right, maybe people want a more focused and attentive viewing experience for those kinds of movies.
Huh.
You know, one where you're not distracted by your phone or whatever's happening at home.
Maybe it goes back to that idea of catering to specific tastes. Even if the overall market is struggling, there will always be an audience for movies that offer something unique.
Okay, so let's talk about Red One for a second. That movie has a budget of $250 million. That's insane.
Wow. Yeah, that's a serious investment. It's almost like a statement, you know?
Yeah.
Like Hollywood is saying, we still believe in the power of the theatrical experience.
Right, they're banking on star power and big action sequences to bring people back to theaters. It's definitely a gamble.
It is, but it'll be interesting to see if it pays off.
Yeah, and let's not forget about the other big movies that are coming out. You have Gladiator 2, which is tapping into that whole nostalgia thing. Then there's Wicked, which already has a huge fan base from the musical. And of course you have Moana 2, which is riding the wave of Disney's recent success with animated movies.
Yeah, those movies all have really high expectations riding on them.
I mean, they have to deliver both financially and in terms of living up to the hype. It's going to be fascinating to see how it all plays out.
Definitely. But in the midst of all this talk about blockbusters and box office numbers, we can't forget about the smaller movies out there. You know, the indie films like Anora that really push the boundaries of filmmaking.
Oh, yeah, those movies are so important. They remind us that film is an art form. It's not just about entertainment. It's about making us think and feel things.
Exactly. And even if they don't make as much money as the big blockbusters, they can have just as much of an impact on the industry.
Absolutely. So it seems like the future of film isn't just about finding the next big hit. It's about creating a diverse landscape where all kinds of movies can thrive.
Right. It's about recognizing that audiences have different tastes and that there's room for all kinds of stories to be told.
Exactly. And as we look ahead to Thanksgiving and the possibility of a big box office boom, let's not forget the lessons we've learned from this quiet fall season.
Yeah, those unexpected successes and the movies that have really connected with audiences, they show us that the cinematic landscape is always evolving, and there are always new ways to connect with viewers.
Yeah, it really does feel like we're at a crossroads. Like the future of film is still being written.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so exciting. We're not just observers, you know? We're actually helping to shape what cinema will become.
Right. Think about it every time we decide to go to the theater or watch something on a streaming service. We're sending a message to the industry. We're telling them what kind of movies we want to see.
Exactly. Every ticket we buy, every movie we stream, it all adds up. It all influences what kinds of stories get told on screen.
Yeah, it's kind of like we're all voting for the future of film. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the box office, I think the big takeaway here is this.
The future of film is in our hands. We have the power to choose what we watch.